Hey everybody, just a quick reminder that if you'd like to show your support for the CyberWire podcast, you can do so in a number of ways. Of course, you can go on over to our Patreon page, that's patreon.com/thecyberwire, and become a supporter there. The other great thing you could do is go over to iTunes and leave us a review. That's a great way to help people find our show, find out what we're all about. We do appreciate it. Thanks. Clipper malware is ejected from Google Play. A different cryptojacker is kicking its competitors out of infected machines. Australian authorities continue to investigate the attempted hack of Parliament, with Chinese intelligence services as the prime suspects. How do you solve a problem like Huawei? Russia prepares to test its ability to disconnect from the internet in the event of war. And prosecutors investigate alleged blackmail by below-the-belt selfie. It's time to take a moment to tell you about our sponsor, Recorded Future. They help security teams make more confident decisions faster. Recorded Future's technology automates broad collection and analysis of cyber threat data and delivers the rich external context you need to understand alerts and emerging threats. With real-time threat intelligence from Recorded Future, security teams respond to threats 63% faster and find undetected threats 10 times quicker. Recorded Future integrates with the security products you already use, making the intelligence you need accessible and relevant. Use it to improve your security operations, incident response, vulnerability management, and much more. If you're facing challenges like the cybersecurity skills shortage or more alerts than your team can handle, consider Recorded Future Threat Intelligence. To get started, go to recordedfuture.com/cyberwire and sign up to receive free threat intelligence updates from Recorded Future. The insights are timely, solid, and always on the money. And we thank Recorded Future for sponsoring our show. The CyberWire podcast is made possible in part by RSA Conference, taking place March 4th through the 8th at the Moscone Center in San Francisco. The CyberWire is a proud media sponsor of RSA Conference, where the world talks security. Learn more and register today at rsaconference.com/cyberwire19. From the CyberWire studios at Data Tribe, I'm Dave Bittner with your CyberWire summary for Monday, February 11th, 2019. Clipper malware, the kind of malicious code that copies and exfiltrates the contents of a clipboard, has been found in the Google Play Store. ESET blogs that it's discovered a strain of the malware, which it tracks as Android Clipper.c, impersonating MetaMask. MetaMask is a legitimate app that allows a user to run Ethereum dApps in a browser without the necessity of operating a full Ethereum node. The Clipper malware targets Ethereum users. It copies their wallet address from a clipboard, which is usually where such addresses are kept, since they're complicated and effectively impossible to remember otherwise. The malware attempts to steal alt-currency credentials, and it also replaces the wallet address in the user's clipboard with an address that leads to the attacker's own wallet. Google removed the bogus app after ESET reported the infestation on February 1st. There's another relatively new altcoin threat out there too. Trend Micro warns that the XMR Stack Kryptonite cryptocurrency miner is not only active in the wild, specifically in the Linux ecosystem, but that this particular cryptojacker is deeply anti-competitive from a black market point of view. It looks for competing coin miners and other Linux malware on the systems it infects, and then disables them, the better to hog the victim's processing resources for itself. Chinese intelligence services remain prime suspects in the Australian Parliament hack, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation says. The attempt, which is regarded as having been largely unsuccessful, remains under investigation. Suspicion of the Chinese government is based largely on form, a combination of a priori probability, and the tactical similarities between this most recent incident and earlier attacks that have been attributed to China. This doesn't, of course, amount to more than circumstantial evidence, and forensic investigation will take some time. Industry reaction has followed, for the most part, a line of, "See, we keep telling you no one is immune, and here we go again." The Chinese embassy in Canberra has yet to comment, but one can reasonably expect the customary denials. Opinion among the Five Eyes and many of their allies continues to run strongly against Chinese device manufacturers, and especially against Huawei, whose industry leadership and market penetration make it particularly worrisome as a potential security threat. U.S. President Trump is widely expected to sign an executive order that would effectively constitute a broad ban on Chinese manufacturers from participating in U.S. mobile networks. Fortune and others report that the executive order may come as early as this week. Such an executive order has been discussed openly at least since the last week in December. U.S. Secretary of State Pompeo will take up Huawei with Eastern European governments during an upcoming tour. The University of California, Berkeley has announced its intent to further restrict research collaboration with Huawei, but in many places, notably the EU and Australia, attempts to wall off Huawei from participation in R&D products have proven more porous than official rhetoric might lead one to believe. For its part, Huawei continues to say it's baffled by the suspicions it faces, but in a continuing charm offensive, the company also says it's open to supervision by the European Union. Microsoft's Security Response Center said at the Blue Hat conference in Israel last week that risks from delaying one of its patches by even 30 days are now lower than the risk of being hit by a 0-day. 0 days are also now much more likely to be used in highly targeted attacks than they are in mass public campaigns. These developments reflect a shift in attacker culture, approach, and capability. Microsoft also credits its own improved product security with responsibility for the change. It's harder to weaponize a patched bug now than it used to be, and the company also thinks that a better set of defaults, firewall on, and so forth, have helped too. Redmond did add that you'll still get hit if you disregard patching for too long. That is, eventually, the skids will get around to you. Russia will proceed with a test of the autarkic Internet its proposed Digital Economy National Program mandates. ZDNet calls it a plan to disconnect from the Internet, which in a way it is. But in fairness, it also seems a measure designed to give the country's online infrastructure the resilience to cope with full-on cyber warfare. No date has been announced, but the test is expected to be complete before April. The beginning of April is the deadline for comment on the Duma's proposed law. U.S. federal prosecutors are looking into allegations the National Enquirer attempted to blackmail Amazon founder Jeff Bezos. The Enquirer strongly denies that what it did amounted to blackmail, although the emails Mr. Bezos released in his blog late last week do appear to contain the sort of quid pro quo associated with blackmail. Stop the properties you own, like the Washington Post, from doing certain things, and the below-the-belt selfies we've got need never see the light of day. The text of the emails in some respects reminds one of a non-disclosure agreement, but of course a communication from an attorney would be likely to fall into that genre. Saudi Arabia, which had been mentioned in press speculation as having played a role in the matter, presumably because it resented the Washington Post's coverage of Jamal Khashoggi's murder, said over the weekend that it had nothing to do with the Enquirer's emails and knows nothing of the affair. So how did Mr. Pecker's Enquirer get Mr. Bezos's below-the-belt selfies? Speculation about presidential operatives or the wheels within wheels of the deep state is always attractive to those who frequent this 18th century coffeehouse we call the Internet, but getting a hold of an emailed selfie isn't really all that mysterioso. As a Security Boulevard blog post from Errata Security very reasonably points out, there are lots of ways an enterprising sleazehound can lay their virtual, if grubby, hands on these sorts of things. Well, hey, you might object. Surely a new economy billionaire like Mr. Bezos would have solid security, right? Well, sure, maybe, but as Errata's post observes, such selfies usually have recipients, and maybe they're not so secure. Just ask Carlos Danger, we might add. And it's relatively easy to get into someone's email with a credential stuffing attack, especially if they, as so many of us do, reuse passwords. Get a hit from collections number 1 through 5, and Bob's your uncle. Now a moment to tell you about our sponsor, Observe It. The greatest threat to businesses today isn't the outsider trying to get in. It's the people you trust, the ones who already have the keys. Your employees, contractors, and privileged users. In fact, a whopping 60% of online attacks today are carried out by insiders. Can you afford to ignore this real and growing threat? With Observe It, you don't have to. See, most security tools only analyze computer, network, or system data. But to stop insider threats, you need to see what users are doing before an incident occurs. Observit combats insider threats by enabling your security team to detect risky activity, investigate in minutes, effectively respond, and stop data loss. Want to see it in action for yourself? Try Observit for free. No installation required. Go to observit.com/cyberwire. That's observit.com/cyberwire. And we thank Observit for sponsoring our show. And joining me once again is Ben Yellen. He's a senior law and policy analyst at the University of Maryland Center for Health and Homeland Security. Ben, great to have you back. We had an article come by. This was from the Naked Security blog over on Sophos. And Lisa Voss wrote this. This is about politicians blocking social media users and whether or not they're violating the First Amendment. I remember when President Trump came into office, there was a dust-up over this of whether or not he was allowed basically to block people on Twitter. What's going on here?
Yeah, this is just a fascinating issue. So the First Amendment gives us the right to petition our government for redress of grievances. And what that means in plain English is we get to yell at politicians and tell them that what they're doing is wrong and tell them what they should be doing. Traditionally, that's been done by calling one's member of Congress, sending letters to the White House. Obviously, things have changed in the digital age. So what this case was about was, and the article just calls her a bureaucrat, but it's a government official in the state of Virginia who had a personal page or a personal Facebook profile, as well as a profile representing the agency that she worked for, which was the Board of Supervisors in Loudoun County, Virginia. A member of the public, basically an old adversary of this bureaucrat, had written a series of complaints on this person's public Facebook page, and this member of the Board of Supervisors blocked that individual from commenting further. Now, she did end up unblocking him, so to speak, so he was actually only blocked for a relatively limited amount of time. But what the court held is that this is a violation of one's First Amendment right to petition their government. And the idea is that there's this distinction between a public forum and a private forum. So obviously, the law wouldn't allow us to go to a politician's dinner party and yell at them for voting on one way on a piece of legislation. But when we're in a public forum or when they're performing the duties of their office, that's when that First Amendment right is applicable. So that's the distinction that courts have really drawn, whether this is a private, personal social media profile used to conduct a person's, personal affairs versus an official government page. And what the court held here is that this was an official government page. It was a Facebook page representing this member of the Board of Supervisors. It had official government announcements on it. That was the evidence that they had that this was an official use or a public forum. Of course, the elephant in the room here is the president's use of the block button on Twitter as it relates to his personal Twitter account, Real Donald Trump. So he argued unsuccessfully in a New York district court that his Real Donald Trump Twitter account was a private account representing him personally. It was not an official government account, and therefore he had the right to block individual users. And the court, I think correctly in that case, held that the way his Twitter account has evolved since his presidency began, it really is a public forum. And it's hard to argue against that. I mean, he's made personnel announcements from the Real Donald Trump Twitter account. He's announced some very serious policy changes, like we're withdrawing from Syria, all different types of very public declarations that have taken place on his personal Twitter account. And that distinguishes him from previous presidents. Like, obviously, Barack Obama had an official White House Twitter account and his own personal Twitter account. But he did not use his personal Twitter account to make public policy proclamations. The Second Circuit, the Court of Appeals in New York, is going to hear that Trump Twitter case, and we'll see if they take some guidance from this Virginia case. I mean, I think for the president's Twitter account, it's pretty clear cut. He, through his actions, strongly indicates that the real Donald Trump Twitter account is a public forum. It's a place where he makes announcements about public policy, government decisions, appointments, and blocking individual users from being able to access that content, I think, is pretty much a per se violation of the First Amendment.
Now, help me understand. It seems to me like there's a civility issue here. If I go to my congressman's office and I stand outside the door and I yell and scream and spew profanities and insults, isn't it within their right to eventually remove me?
Yes. So there are time, place, and manner restrictions that are acceptable under the First Amendment. Some of that, although this isn't universally applied, but some of that can include harassing language, obscenities, etc. And I think that's one of the things that President Trump has tried to argue as it relates to his Twitter account, that people were posting obscenities, offensive language. As it applies to private individuals, that's really a no-brainer. As it applies to public officials, the First Amendment is extremely strong. There are some ideas, political ideas, that cannot properly be expressed without the use of obscenities. It reminds me of one of my favorite First Amendment cases where an individual named Cohen, in the case of Cohen v. California, wore a sweatshirt to a public court proceeding that said, "F the draft." So the rules of the California court said you could not wear clothes with any obscenities within the courtroom. And the Supreme Court said that's a violation of the First Amendment because there's no other way to express that exact sentiment. Saying, "I strongly dislike the military draft," or "screw the draft," is very different than the word that he actually used. So there are Twitter terms of service about harassment, and there are certainly time, place, and manner restrictions about, screaming and yelling at members of Congress. The First Amendment presents a very, very high bar, and I think standard obscenities, if it truly is a public forum, is not something that can be restricted consistent with the First Amendment. We want to have a robust marketplace of ideas. That's what our most cherished Supreme Court justices have written about as it relates to the First Amendment. And if I want to express my opinion very strongly about the president's actions in response to what is pretty clearly to me to be a public forum, a place where he conducts the business of our government, then the First Amendment protects that interest very, very strongly.
All right. It's fascinating to see it play out, as always. Ben Yelin, thanks for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you.
And that's the CyberWire. Thanks to all of our sponsors for making the CyberWire possible, especially our supporting sponsor, Observit, the leading insider threat management platform. Learn more at observit.com. Don't forget to check out the Grumpy Old Geeks podcast, where I contribute to a regular segment called Security Ha. I join Jason and Brian on their show for a lively discussion of the latest security news every week. You can find Grumpy Old Geeks where all the fine podcasts are listed. And check out the Recorded Future podcast, which I also host. The subject there is threat intelligence, and every week we talk to interesting people about timely cybersecurity topics. That's at recordedfuture.com/podcast. The CyberWire podcast is proudly produced in Maryland out of the startup studios of Data Tribe, where they're co-building the next generation of cybersecurity teams and technology. Our CyberWire editor is John Petrick, social media editor Jennifer Iben, technical editor Chris Russell, executive editor Peter Kilpie, and I'm Dave Bittner. Thanks for listening.